Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. Last week we looked at various responses that we might have to failure. And we looked at failure because we knew from the gospel lesson that in fact, by all standards, the prodigal son, the younger son, had failed. And so we looked at how he responded, and we took a look at two broad responses that often occur when we look at failure. The one response is when we respond with guilt, where we feel guilty about what we failed to do or guilty about what we did. And when we feel guilty, we have the tendency to say, okay, next time I'm going to try harder. And as Ben Hartman puts it, once we get into the circle of guilt, trying harder, we become fatigued and then we quit. We say to ourselves, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with all these church activities. I've had it. Nobody volunteers. I'm always the one stuck with what's going on. And when we say that we're going to quit, we then listen to a sermon, or perhaps a neighbor comes to us, or a young child, daughter, son, and challenges us. And then we say, okay, I'm going to try harder. And we feel guilty for having quit. We try harder, and we keep on going that way. And that's one way that we can respond to our own failure. There's a second way that we can respond to failure, and that is we can rely on the grace of God. Rather than feeling guilty, which we might in any case, but rather than getting stuck in the guilt as if we were stuck with our boots in the mud, rather than just shut me off. Who is the person who did that? Red, that means that I've not run out of batteries. Can you hear me? It's always a stupid question. If you can't hear me, how can you answer? But every speaker does it. Can you hear me? The back row, can you hear me? Rather than getting stuck in our guilt, and rather than focusing on what we can do about it, we ask God to enter the picture. And He's always willing to do so with His grace and with His mercy and with His love. And when we experience that kind of grace, when we experience God in that way, then we have a tendency to want to draw near to Him, to be close to Him. And when we draw near to Him, we then start to feel rest, and we start to feel energized. And then we want to love and we want to serve, not because we are trying harder in order to cover up our failures, but because we know that God is a loving God, and He just wants us to develop and to grow in the grace and mercy that comes only from Him. And then we love and we serve, and then we experience more grace. Now, the reason I'm summarizing this again is not only because it's such an important issue for us to get a hold of, but I'm summarizing it because the key aspect, or the key reason why we respond either in this way or respond in the first way with guilt, is how we see God. If we see God as a judge, if we see God as somebody who doesn't really care for us or want the best for us, but just sits up there and wants to order us around, if we see Him in such a judgmental role, we're always going to respond in the guilt fashion, because we feel that we have to try harder in order to gain God's love, and that just doesn't work. If, on the other hand, we experience God as somebody who is loving and caring, somebody who is good, then it's easy for us, not necessarily easy, but then it is compelling us to respond in the second way. And so when we looked last week at the issue of the Father, we looked at Him as one who was expected to be like the Father in those ancient days. Somebody who was stern, somebody who would have people come to Him. And instead, the prodigal son found a God who was running towards him, breaking all of modicums, breaking all the standards, just to have his son back. He'd been looking out the window, waiting for his son, waiting and waiting. And when he saw the first faintest image of his son, speech prepared, and he was going to basically say, hey, Dad, I'm not worthy of anything that you might do. Just let me be one of the hired hands, and we someday can talk about what that speech really means. But for our purposes, what it meant was he tried to buy himself back into the good graces with the work that he wanted to do. And before the Father would have, or before the Son had even the opportunity to finish, the Father had already marched on and said, come on, we're going to have a party. We're going to celebrate. We're going to enjoy the fact that you are back. Kill the fatted calf. Get the ring out. Get the robe out. Get the sandals. My son is back. He was lost, and yet he is found. It's so important to recognize that when that statement is made, what is really being said is not that we are celebrating because the Son found his way back. You see, that's a try harder guilt response. But we're celebrating because he was lost and he was found. He was found by the Father. And that's so true for us. Now let's continue, because as the parable states, there were 2 sons. And since there were 2 sons, we ought to take a look at the other son, because we haven't done that yet. And he said there was a man who had 2 sons. So far, we've only looked at the prodigal. So far, we've only looked at the prodigal because Jesus has already talked about the lostness of the sheep and the lostness of the coin. And he's talking to 2 different groups, remember? He's talking on one hand to what? The Pharisees. He's talking to the tax collectors. And he's talking to the sinners. And when he's talking to these 2 different groups, I can see the groups at first, when they hear about the first prodigal, I can hear the Pharisees saying to themselves, now we are going to find out the real basis for this prophet or this rabbi's perspective. But then when they went on, they discovered that they were being put on the spot, because Jesus was not just talking to the sinners, he was also talking to the Pharisees. And so we continue, and he said there were a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said no to his father, and Father, give me a share of property, etc. And now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. But the older son was angry, and he refused to go in to his father, and his father had to come out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, those many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command, yet you have what? You never gave me even a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. Suddenly, the prodigals no longer remind the Pharisees of themselves, but now they remind them that they are like the older son. There's a great writer by the name of G.K. Chesterton. And G.K. Chesterton one time read in a newspaper of his day, this was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he read in the newspaper a question that was raised by the editor, what is wrong with the world? And Chesterton wrote back, I am, sincerely, G.K. Chesterton. That kind of self-recognition is exceedingly important for us to get our minds around. Because you see, it is extremely important for the Pharisees to recognize themselves in the older son, and even though the older son represents virtue, whereas the younger son represented vice, both of them are in fact going far away from their Father. Do you get the picture? In other words, Jesus is sort of pulling the rug out from underneath the Pharisees when he says, look, yes, your younger son was engaging in all sorts of vices, in all sorts of sins. But your older son, the older son, was just as bad. His virtue kept him from me. The pride that arises out of leading a virtue, or potentially arises out of leading a virtuous life, life, that kind of pride can separate you from the Father just as a life of vice can. The Pharisees had to start looking at themselves. In the 1890s, there was a group called the Three Sisters, the Cherry Sisters. They were from Marion, Iowa. And on some occasion, maybe there was some kind of a festival or competition, they prepared a skit. They presented that skit. It was absolutely awful. Everybody agreed. I mean, the local newspaper said it was awful, but they invited them back the next year because they were so awful. And people in the meantime said, if they're that bad, I want to go and see them. And so for about a period of 3 years, these Cherry Sisters were going all over Iowa, presenting their awful act. They would have tomatoes thrown at them, vegetables. They had to actually get a homemade prepared screen that they could set up in front of them in order to prevent the cherries and the tomatoes and potatoes or whatever they were throwing from hitting them. And then a guy by the name of Hammerstein, who was a mogul on Broadway, Oscar Hammerstein, heard about them. And he invited them to come to Broadway. And the response was equally bad or equally good, depending on how. You know what it reminded me of when I read this story? How many of you remember Tiny Tim? Remember Tiny Tim? Tiptoe through the tulips. Remember that? And you would tiptoe and he played this little banjo or a little guitar that he had. And you never were quite sure whether the joke was on him or whether the joke was on us for watching. And these Cherry Sisters were on Broadway, and they actually had a contract where they would receive $1,000, which in those days was an incredible amount of money, $1,000 a week for performing. And they performed all up and down Broadway or whatever theaters they were at. And they, to the last days, were absolutely convinced that they were the greatest act alive. See, that's the problem with the Pharisees. And that's the problem with you and me when we're pharisaical in our attitudes. We convince ourselves that we're next to sliced bread the greatest thing alive. That there's no competition. But in reality, if we were honest with ourselves, we would not only recognize somebody as the prodigal younger son, that we were the prodigal older sons. And so Jesus is challenging the Pharisees here. And then there is this statement that is made that I think is important for us to again focus on. If I can focus with my glasses. But he answered as follows. Look, those many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me even a young goat. Do you see where these Pharisees are coming from? Where this prodigal, the oldest son, is coming from? He's coming from trying harder. He's coming from a perspective that basically says that I can earn my way. That you owe me. You owe me a response, they're saying to God. If you expect me to behave well, you owe me a response. You owe me some goodies. You owe me a party. It's a right that I have, the right that I have earned. And it's incredibly important for us to catch ourselves when we play that kind of game with God. Because we're all prone to do it. We're all prone to say, look, you know, I'm trying to lose some weight right now. If I don't lose weight every day, I say to myself, oh God, why aren't you letting me lose weight? I know why. I probably ate a cookie or something else. But the point that I'm making is that it's extremely easy for us to say to God, you owe me. How many of you have heard of Elizabeth Elliot? She was the wife of the missionary in 1956. She and her husband went to the Auca Indians in Ecuador, and he was killed by the Auca Indians. And she had a ministry that was incredibly influential. She just died last year. And this happened in 1956 when her husband was killed. We had the opportunity to hear her at Moody on one of story that is not in the Bible but is based upon the Bible. And the story goes something like this. One day Jesus was walking with his disciples, and he said to his disciples, he said, pick up a stone and carry it for me. And the disciples looked at him, and they saw lots of stones around, and picked up a stone, and Peter said to himself, he didn't say anything about how big the stone should be. He said, I'm going to pick the smallest pebble that I can find and put it in my pocket. After all, why should I carry a big stone around? And so he did that, and after about a 3-hour journey, they came to a nice place, and Jesus said, let's have lunch. He took his hand and he rubbed it across and the area where he was, and all the stones turned into bread. And they ate lunch. Except Peter's lunch was very small and very short, and he didn't get a lot. And so after they had finished, Jesus said to them again, he said, carry a stone for me. He said, and follow me. And Peter said to himself, wow. He said, I got this thing figured out. And so he picked up the biggest stone that he could find, and he carried it on his shoulders, and he was walking along, and finally they got to a place, to a river, where there was time for them to eat supper. And Jesus said to them, he said, throw your stones into the water. And he threw them into the water. And Peter was sort of grumbling, and the disciples were trying to figure out, what is this Jesus trying to do? And Jesus, overhearing this, said to Peter and the disciples, he said, for whom will you carry the stone? Remember what I asked you to do? To carry the stone for me. But you are acting as if you were carrying the stone for yourself. It's dangerous when we get to the point where you and I begin to recognize ourselves not in our desires to have everything for ourselves, but delude ourselves into thinking that we're doing it for somebody else, that we're doing it for Jesus. When we actually are doing it all too often, at least from my perspective as I see myself, actually I all too often carry things for God so that I can benefit from them. And so that's the second thing that we find here. That in fact, Jesus says, or the older son says, you owe me. And then the father says, but when this son of yours came who was devoured, or this is continuing what the older son is saying, but when this son of yours came who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. There's an old Jewish story about two merchants in a small community who were competitors to the point where they hated each other. And one hated the other one even more. And whatever happened, whatever good things happened to the one, the other one would be upset about. On one occasion, God visited the merchant, one of the merchants. And he said to the merchant, he said, I'll give you everything, anything that you want. There's only one condition. Whatever I give you, I will give twice to the other merchant. Whatever you want, on the condition that I will give twice as much to the other merchant. The merchant looked at him, looked at God and said, really? He said, yeah. Strike me blind in one eye. Strike me blind in one eye. Wow. How the hatred can develop in us when we look out only for ourselves. How the hatred can grow when we're so concerned not about somebody else, but concerned about ourselves. I had a wonderful professor, very close. His name was Marlon Butts. He was professor at Lutheran Theological Seminary. And his definition of maturity has always stuck with me. Maturity, he said, is the ability to enjoy when good things happen to other people. Maturity is the ability to enjoy when good things happen to other people. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about the ability to celebrate when something wonderful happens to the younger